The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room fell silent as Jasmine Crockett adjusted the microphone before her. The freshman congresswoman from Texas sat upright, her burgundy suit neatly pressed, while across the table, Senator Ted Cruz flipped through his papers with the easy confidence of a man who had never lost a debate in this chamber. What happened next, however, would mark a turning point. Before we continue, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss key political moments like the one about to unfold. Because what you're about to see is something few have ever witnessed. Ted Cruz, completely at a loss for words. The tension in the room was unmistakable. Cruz had already interrupted Crockett 5 times during her opening remarks on voting rights legislation, each interjection more dismissive than the last. Everyone in the room could sense a 6th was coming, but Crockett had come prepared, ready to turn what should have been a routine hearing into one of the most watched exchanges of the year. "Senator Cruz," Crockett began, her tone calm but firm. "I've counted your interruptions today. We're at 5. I'm curious to see if you'll reach 7 before I finish explaining why your arguments are not only incorrect, but fundamentally misinformed." The room stirred. Cameras rose from every angle. C-SPAN's viewership spiked almost instantly. Ted Cruz's confident expression slowly shifted into something unexpected, genuine unease. This wasn't just another committee hearing. It was the moment Jasmine Crockett, a first-term representative from Dallas, would do what many had tried and failed to do for years: challenge Ted Cruz on his own ground, using his own tactics, in front of millions watching live. To grasp the full weight of this exchange, it helps to understand who these two figures are. Jasmine Crockett wasn't expected to make it this far. Just 2 years earlier, she was a civil rights attorney in Dallas, taking on cases big firms avoided, defending clients who couldn't afford representation and challenging systemic injustice one case at a time. When she decided to run for Congress, political insiders dismissed her chances. A young black woman from Texas, they said, couldn't possibly change Washington. But Crockett wasn't interested in playing by the old rules. She came to rewrite them. In her first months in Congress, she studied relentlessly, learning every rule and procedural nuance. While others delivered speeches, she spent nights in the Library of Congress reviewing 50 years of debate transcripts. She understood that to change the system, she had to know it better than those who built it. Ted Cruz, by contrast, represented the political establishment. A Princeton and Harvard law graduate, former Solicitor General of Texas, and longtime senator, he had built his brand on intellect and debate dominance. His signature tactic was the interruption, a well-timed challenge meant to throw opponents off balance, derail their train of thought, and seize control of the conversation. He had used it effectively for years, against seasoned senators, cabinet officials, and experts alike. The interruption wasn't just a habit, it was a strategy he had perfected, and in 15 years, no one had successfully countered it. The stakes that day extended beyond the proposed voting rights bill. This was a test of power: who had the right to speak, and who would be silenced. The legislation sought to restore voting protections that had been rolled back over the last decade. For Cruz, blocking it meant preserving his party's electoral advantage in Texas. For Crockett, it was about protecting her constituents' right to be heard. People who often waited hours in line just to cast a ballot. Beneath the policy clash, however, was a deeper struggle: the old guard versus new voices. The question was whether traditional dominance and procedural control would continue to define Washington, or whether someone like Crockett could challenge that culture. The hearing had been underway for over 90 minutes. Cruz was in top form, cutting off witnesses, redirecting questions, and steering every discussion. Party lines didn't matter. When Cruz wanted to speak, the room fell silent. That was simply how things worked. Then Crockett began her presentation. She was the final speaker of the day, and most assumed Cruz would ease up. They were both Texans, after all, and a measure of mutual respect was expected. But something about her composure unsettled him. She wasn't deferential. She didn't preface her remarks with pleasantries. She spoke with authority, as though she had every right to be there, and that was something Cruz couldn't ignore. The first interruption came just 3 minutes in. Crockett was outlining the impact of polling place closures in Texas when Cruz cut in sharply. "Representative Crockett, surely you're not suggesting—" "Senator?" she replied evenly. "I'm in the middle of presenting data. I'll take your questions when I've finished." Her tone was polite but firm. Around the room, heads turned. It was rare for anyone to push back on Cruz's first interruption. He smiled, the same rehearsed smile he often used when challenged. Part amusement, part dismissal. He leaned back, feigning patience, though his tapping fingers hinted at irritation. 2 minutes later came the second interruption. Crockett was showing a map of polling site closures when Cruz leaned forward again. "This data is misleading." Senator Cruz," Crockett interjected smoothly. "You'll have a full opportunity to respond. For now, I'm presenting evidence that deserves to be heard in full." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even look up from her notes. Her delivery was controlled, confident, and unshaken. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Staffers who had been scrolling through their phones suddenly looked up. Other senators leaned forward in their seats. Something unusual was happening. Senator Cruz's interruptions were usually expected, almost routine, but few ever challenged them directly. The third interruption came sharper than before. Representative Jasmine Crockett was presenting her data on voter wait times when Cruz's voice cut through the air. "This is absolutely ridiculous. You can't just present one-sided—" "Senator Cruz, that's 3, Crockett said calmly, her tone cutting through his words. She finally looked up and locked eyes with him. "I'm counting." A hush fell over the room. Had she really just counted his interruptions aloud? No one had ever done that before. It was a small act, but it changed everything. She was exposing his behavior in real time, making it visible, undeniable. "I'm simply trying to ensure accuracy," Cruz started. "That's 4, Crockett replied, then continued her remarks as if nothing had happened. The air in the room thickened. Committee chair. Dick Durbin looked uncertain, as though debating whether to step in. But technically, nothing Crockett said violated the rules. She wasn't being disrespectful. She was simply keeping count. Still, everyone could feel the balance of power shifting. Cruz's 5th interruption came with a different approach. He lowered his voice, attempting to sound measured. "Representative Crockett, I think we'd all appreciate if you could clarify." 5, she noted, making a small mark in her papers. "Senator Cruz, you've interrupted me 5 times in 10 minutes. I'm just curious. Is this a Senate record or your personal best?" Laughter rippled quietly across the room. Someone at the back even clapped before being hushed. Cruz's face reddened. He was cornered. If he interrupted again, he'd prove her point. If he stayed silent, he'd lose control. But Cruz couldn't help himself. It was like watching someone touch a hot stove even after being warned. As Crockett began citing voter testimonies, Cruz leaned into his microphone again. "These anecdotes don't represent—" "6, Crockett said sharply, setting her papers down. The room froze. "Senator Cruz, you've now interrupted me 6 times. Before you reach 7, I want you to know I came prepared." She reached into her folder and lifted a stack of documents. "I have here transcripts from the last 15 committee hearings you've attended. Would you like to know how many times you've interrupted female witnesses compared to male ones?" Cruz blinked, then said nothing. "The ratio is 4-1. You interrupt women 4 times more often than men, and black women 6 times more often. And black women from Texas?" She paused slightly. "Let's just say I'm not the first." The room buzzed with energy. Staffers were already typing furiously on their phones. Someone whispered, "This is going viral." Cruz looked stunned. His confidence slipped as he opened his mouth, then shut it again. "That's a completely unfair characterization," he finally muttered. "Is it?" Crockett asked evenly, pulling out another page. January 15th. You interrupted Professor Angela Davis 17 times in 30 minutes. February 3rd, Dr. Patricia Williams 12 times. March 22nd, State Representative Nicole Collier 21 times. Would you like me to continue? Cruz's face turned from red to pale. His usual composure was gone. He glanced around, but no one met his eyes. Even his own party colleagues avoided looking at him. Senator John Kennedy stared into his coffee. Senator Josh Hawley studied the ceiling. "This is an ambush." Cruz finally managed to say. "No, Senator," Crockett replied evenly. "An ambush is when someone interrupts 6 times while another is presenting verified data on voter suppression. What I'm doing is called preparation. There's a difference." She turned back to her presentation, though everyone could tell this was far from finished. The atmosphere in the room was charged. Staffers held their phones up. Cameras zoomed in on Cruz's face, which flickered through emotions like a faulty display. "Now, as I was saying before the 6th interruption," Crockett continued, her voice calm and precise, "the data clearly demonstrates a consistent pattern of voter disenfranchisement, particularly in Houston County." Cruz could barely contain himself. Losing control, being publicly challenged, and the counting, it was more than his ego could bear. His career had been built on command, on dominating every exchange. He couldn't let this stand. He knew it was a trap, but pride pushed him forward. He leaned toward his microphone, voice laced with sarcasm. "Representative Crockett, your little performance might impress your Twitter followers, but 7. The single word hung in the air. Crockett stood up slowly, deliberately. She moved to the side of her table so everyone could see her clearly. The room was completely silent. Even the usual background chatter and clicking keyboards had stopped. Security guards leaned in to watch. "Senator Cruz," she began, her voice clear and firm, "you've now interrupted me 7 times. 7 times you've attempted to cut me off. 7 times you've tried to stop the American people from hearing the truth about what's happening in our state." She lifted a remote and clicked it. A video appeared. On the screen behind her, footage of Cruz speaking at a recent event. The radical left. Cruz's recorded voice thundered, wants to silence conservative voices. They can't win on ideas, so they try to prevent us from speaking. Crockett paused the video. "Interesting philosophy, Senator," she said evenly. "So tell me, what exactly are you doing right now?" The room was completely still. The only sounds were the soft hum of the air conditioning and a few uneasy breaths from the back row. Ted Cruz sat motionless, caught between anger and disbelief, a moment that photographers would later describe as the instant he realized he had lost control of the narrative, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't finished. "You know what the real issue is, Senator?" she continued, walking slowly along the table like a prosecutor addressing a jury. "You've been doing this for so long, you don't even recognize it anymore. The constant interruptions, talking over people, ignoring voices that don't sound like yours. It's become habit." She pressed the remote again. This time, a montage appeared. Clips of Cruz interrupting witnesses over the years. Women, people of color, activists, senior citizens. The interruptions came one after another in rapid succession, forming a near-rhythmic pattern of Cruz's voice cutting people off. Mid-sentence. "That's inaccurate. You're misunderstanding my point. Let me explain what you really mean. That's just not true." The video lasted a full minute. By the time it ended, even some of Cruz's colleagues looked uneasy. Senator Susan Collins was scribbling something quickly in her notebook. Senator Mitt Romney had his hand covering his mouth, but his eyes said everything. "More than 143 interruptions in the past 6 months alone," Crockett said, reading calmly from her notes. "That's an average of 1 interruption every 12 minutes of testimony. But here's where it gets interesting. When Fortune 500 CEOs testify, your interruption rate drops to once every 45 minutes. When oil executives speak, it's once an hour. But when it's someone like me, it happens every 3 minutes." Cruz finally spoke. "This is character assassination." "No, Senator," Crockett replied evenly. "It's mathematics. Numbers don't lie. They don't have political bias. They simply reflect what's true, and what they show is a clear pattern." She walked back toward her seat but didn't sit down. Instead, she pulled out another thicker folder. "Would you like to know what else I found in my research, Senator?" Cruz gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles pale. "This is not what this hearing is about." "Oh, but it is," Crockett said, cutting him off for the first time. "This hearing is about voting rights, about whose voices are heard and whose are silenced. And you, Senator Cruz, have just provided a perfect example of how that silencing happens." She opened the folder. "Let's look at your voting record on election legislation. In 2019, you voted against the Voting Rights Advancement Act. In 2020, You opposed the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. In 2021, you voted against the For the People Act. And during those hearings, you interrupted witnesses supporting those bills an average of 8 times each. Those bills were examples of federal overreach, Cruz began. I'm not finished, Crockett interjected firmly. You see, Senator, I didn't come here to argue with you. I came to present evidence. Evidence that shows how you've repeatedly worked to make voting more difficult, while also interrupting or dismissing anyone who calls in. Attention to it, she unfolded a large map of Texas and pointed to specific areas. In these counties where polling locations were closed, your campaign received notable donations from organizations that actively lobbied for those closures. Is that just coincidence? Cruz stood abruptly. I don't have to sit here and listen to these baseless claims. Then don't sit, Crockett replied sharply. Stand and be accountable. Stand and explain to the people of Texas why you think they should wait 8 hours in line to vote. Stand and tell them why their voices matter less than your donors. The room was alive with energy. Staffers stood to get a clearer view, and the C-SPAN cameras switched rapidly between Cruz and Crockett. Online, Your 6th Interruptions was already trending worldwide. Cruz made his next move, and it would cost him. He drew on years of debate experience, determined to regain control. Representative Crockett, he began. Your performance today is exactly what's wrong with modern politics. Instead of discussing serious policy, you're turning this into a spectacle. You're grandstanding for social media attention while real legislators are trying to work. This is why freshman representatives should learn to what, Senator? Crockett's voice cut cleanly through his sentence. Learn to be quiet? Learn to accept constant interruptions? Learn their place? She picked up her phone and held it up for all to see. Do you know what this is, Senator? This is democracy in the 21st century. Right now, over 3 million people are watching this live. 3 million Americans are now watching how you treat people who dare to disagree with you. 3 million voters are witnessing in real time what you truly think about their right to be heard. Crockett placed her phone down and held up one last document. This, she said evenly, is a letter signed by every Democratic member of the Texas House of Representatives. Every single one. Cruz didn't respond. He was still standing, but his posture had collapsed, shoulders tense, face flushed, his confidence fading. This letter, Crockett continued, states that they support federal voting rights legislation because they've seen the consequences when those protections disappear. It says they're tired of watching their constituents be systematically silenced. And finally, let me quote directly, we stand with Representative Crockett as she speaks truth to power, no matter how many times she's interrupted. The room broke into applause. It wasn't just Democrats, staffers, reporters, even a few security personnel joined in. The sound filled the chamber as Chairman Durbin pounded his gavel, trying in vain to restore order. Cruz leaned into his microphone, shouting above the noise. This is a violation of committee rules. Chairman Durbin, I demand, Crockett interrupted smoothly. 8. The laughter that followed wasn't mocking. It was the sound of collective realization. The kind of laughter that comes when the truth finally surfaces. Cruz stood frozen, at a loss for words. After a long pause, he gathered his papers, turned, and walked out. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, echoing through the chamber. Cameras flashed. Phones recorded. The audience stood in stunned silence, knowing they had just witnessed a moment that would go viral worldwide. Crockett waited for calm to return before speaking again. Mr. Chairman, she said in her composed, professional tone, I'd like to continue my presentation on voting rights. Without interruption, it should only take about 10 more minutes. Durbin, still visibly shaken, nodded. The witness may proceed. Before she could continue, Senator Elizabeth Warren rose from the back of the room and began a slow, deliberate clap. One by one, others joined her, some Democrats, a few independents, even a handful of Republicans, enough to show that something had shifted in that chamber. When the applause subsided, Crockett resumed her testimony. For 10 uninterrupted minutes, she presented her findings with clarity and precision. No one spoke over her. As she finished, she collected her materials and headed toward the door. But just before leaving, she turned back with a faint smile. Oh, And Senator Cruz's interruption count today? That's actually below his average. Last year, he interrupted Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee 14 times in 20 minutes. So, technically, this was progress. The room erupted once more as she exited, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Behind her, the committee room buzzed with energy, the moment already spreading across social media. Within an hour, her testimony had become the most viewed congressional hearing in C-SPAN's history. News outlets were calling it the 7 Interruptions. Heard around the world, political. Analysts described it as one of the most effective takedowns of a senior senator ever broadcast. But the real victory wasn't the confrontation, it was what came afterward. Crockett's data, her arguments, and her evidence on voter suppression were now front-page news. People were talking, not about the clash, but about the issue itself. Senator Cruz attempted damage control, releasing a statement accusing Crockett of staging a political stunt for viral attention instead of focusing on policy. But his rebuttal was overshadowed by breaking news. Newly resurfaced footage showed him repeatedly interrupting female witnesses during past hearings. A viral compilation titled, "Ted Cruz Interrupts Women for 10 Minutes Straight," racked up over 50 million views in just 24 hours. Even some Republican colleagues began quietly distancing themselves. Senator John Cornyn was among the first. Cruz's fellow Texas senator told reporters, "Everyone deserves to be heard during committee hearings without unnecessary interruptions." Senator Lisa Murkowski was even more straightforward. "What we saw today was long overdue." But the most surprising response came from an unexpected voice, former Republican Senator Bob Corker. He tweeted, "I served with Ted Cruz for 6 years. What Representative Crockett did today was something many of us wanted to do, but never had the courage to. Bravo." Crockett's victory was clear, yet she avoided any personal celebration. In every interview, she redirected attention back to the core issue, voting rights. Speaking with CNN's Jake Tapper, she said, "This isn't about me versus Senator Cruz. It's about making sure every American has equal access to the ballot box. If highlighting interruptions helped people pay attention to that, then it was worth it." The aftermath of what became known as the 7 Interruptions hearing spread through American politics like ripples in a pond. Within 24 hours, the moment had grown beyond politics into popular culture. The number 7 became a meme, used everywhere from corporate meetings to family gatherings whenever someone refused to stop interrupting. Saturday Night Live wrote sketches about it. Stephen Colbert dedicated an entire monologue to the exchange. But the real change happened inside Congress. The very next day, something remarkable occurred. During a Senate Foreign Relations Committee meeting, Senator Rand Paul began to interrupt a witness, then paused and said, "I'm sorry. Please continue." Witnesses across Washington noticed a shift. Committee hearings suddenly felt more respectful. No one wanted to be the next Ted Cruz. Representative Jasmine Crockett became an overnight sensation, but not in the usual political way. She didn't chase fame, she leveraged it. In every media appearance, she steered the conversation back to voting rights. When Trevor Noah asked about the confrontation on The Daily Show, she responded by showing a map of polling locations that had been closed. When she appeared on The View, she brought along 5 Texas voters who had been disenfranchised. The numbers told the story. C-SPAN, which typically drew around 300,000 viewers for committee hearings, saw more than 45 million views of that exchange across platforms. Google searches for voting rights legislation skyrocketed by 3,000%, and over 400 town halls on voting access were organized nationwide. Young Americans who had never watched a congressional hearing before were suddenly quoting parliamentary rules. Meanwhile, Ted Cruz faced something unfamiliar: real consequences. Even his Republican colleagues began to distance themselves. At a GOP caucus meeting, he reportedly tried to justify his behavior, but was met with what one senator called Arctic silence. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana summed it up best. "When you're in a hole, stop digging." Ted Cruz brought more than just arguments to that hearing. He brought an excavator, and it buried him. Corporate donors quickly took notice. 3 major Texas-based companies that had supported his campaigns announced they were reevaluating their political contributions. A petroleum company CEO told the Wall Street Journal anonymously, We donate to politicians who can effectively represent our interests. Getting dismantled by a freshman congresswoman on national television doesn't exactly qualify as effective. But the most serious fallout came from within Texas itself. Just 3 days after the hearing, a statewide poll revealed Cruz's approval rating had dropped by 12 points. Even more damaging, 67% of Texas Republicans said they were embarrassed by his behavior. At a long-planned Houston town hall, Cruz faced an unfamiliar scene, heckling from his own supporters. When he tried to talk over a constituent asking about healthcare, someone shouted, "That's one!" The crowd laughed. Cruz left after just 20 minutes. Meanwhile, the Texas Democratic Party saw record volunteer sign-ups and donations. Beto O'Rourke, who had narrowly lost to Cruz in 2018, tweeted, "Jasmine Crockett did in 18 minutes what I couldn't do in 18 months. Show Texas who Ted Cruz really is." Even Republicans began to reflect. Senator Marco Rubio told Politico, "We need to be better about letting people speak, especially when we disagree." The optics of interrupting witnesses, particularly women and minorities, are terrible and flat-out wrong. Soon after, the Senate Rules Committee convened an emergency meeting to discuss limits on interruptions during testimony. Senator Amy Klobuchar introduced what became known as the Crockett Rule. Witnesses must be allowed to finish their opening statements without interruption. It passed unanimously, with Cruz himself voting in favor, though he didn't attend the session in person. 2 weeks later, something remarkable happened. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which had been stalled for months, suddenly gained momentum. 3 Republican senators announced their support for a revised version of the bill. Senator Murkowski specifically cited Crockett's hearing, saying, "Representative Crockett's presentation showed we need to have a serious discussion about voting access, not political theater." Crockett, meanwhile, was careful with her newfound influence. She avoided overexposure, turning down most media requests to focus on building coalitions in Congress. She quietly met with Republican representatives from Texas, finding shared priorities on issues like infrastructure and veterans affairs. "I didn't come to Washington to go viral," she told her staff. "I came here to get things done." Still, the confrontation's impact spread far beyond politics. Across corporate America, women began to push back against interruptions in meetings. The Harvard Business Review published an article titled "The Crockett Effect: How Counting Changes Conversation," showing a 40% decline in interruptions in workplaces where someone referenced the incident. Universities began teaching the moment in political communication and leadership courses. A Georgetown professor called it a master class in preparation meeting opportunity. Students analyzed Crockett's timing, tone, and command of evidence frame by frame. Even globally, the moment resonated. The BBC aired a segment on the art of the political takedown. A British MP tweeted that she was taking notes, Le Monde called it a perfect example of American political theater at its sharpest. 3 months later, when the voting rights bill came to a vote, something unprecedented occurred. Ted Cruz abstained. He didn't vote for it, but he didn't vote against it either. Sources said he couldn't risk another public clash with Crockett, who was expected to testify. The bill passed by 2 votes. At the signing ceremony, President Biden invited Crockett to stand beside him. As he signed, he leaned over and whispered, "7 interruptions, huh? I've been in the Senate for decades. Never saw anything like that." Crockett smiled but stayed composed. This wasn't about her victory. It was about millions of Americans gaining greater access to the ballot box. Still, she allowed herself one quiet moment of satisfaction. As she exited the White House, a reporter shouted, "Representative Crockett, any message for Senator Cruz?" She paused and smiled slightly. "I hope he's learned that every voice deserves to be heard, without interruption." The reporter followed up. "Do you think he has?" "Well," Crockett replied, "he's been pretty quiet lately. That's a start." The impact didn't fade. Political science textbooks began including the confrontation as a case study in effective communication. A documentary team followed Crockett for a year, creating what would become an Emmy-winning film. Cruz, meanwhile, tried to rebuild his image. He went on a listening tour across Texas, made a show of not interrupting anyone, and hired a new communications team. He even joked at a dinner. I learned to count to 7 the hard way, but the damage was done. In every committee hearing that followed, someone was counting. A year later, at the Washington Press Club dinner, Crockett received the Political Moment of the Year award. In her acceptance speech, she reflected, "People ask if I planned it. The truth is I prepared for it. But you can't script authenticity. You can only be ready when the moment arrives. Senator Cruz gave me an opportunity to show what millions of people experience every day. Being silenced, talked over, dismissed." She paused before concluding. "Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is count. Count the interruptions. The votes, the closed polling places, the hours people wait to cast a ballot. Make the invisible visible. That's how change happens, one number at a time." The audience rose in applause, even some Republicans. Cruz wasn't there. His absence said enough. As Crockett left the stage, a young intern stopped her. "Representative Crockett, thank you. I get interrupted all the time in meetings, and now I count. Knowing the number gives me power." Crockett smiled. "That's the thing about counting. Anyone can do it. You don't need a title. You just need to pay attention and refuse to be silenced." The ripple effect continued. Political scientists began tracking the interruption index, measuring how often lawmakers interrupted witnesses by gender, race, and age. The findings were damning, prompting reforms. In Texas, the political landscape shifted. Voter registration rose 23% in counties most affected by polling closures. Young candidates, inspired by Crockett, ran under the slogan, "Every voice counts." The Texas Tribune launched a series titled After 7, documenting the changes in political culture since the confrontation. Eventually, Cruz announced he would not seek re-election, citing new opportunities. Insiders knew the truth. He was polling too low to win. His clash with Crockett had become his political epitaph. Yet the confrontation's greatest legacy wasn't Cruz's fall. It was the transformation of discourse itself. Hearings became more respectful. Witnesses were allowed to finish. "Let them finish" became a common refrain. Politics wasn't perfect, but it was better. 5 years later, Jasmine Crockett was sworn in as the new U.S. Senator from Texas, defeating Cruz's chosen successor by 15 points. Reflecting on that day in the New York Times, she said, "I never planned to become the interruption counter, but sometimes history chooses your role. Ted Cruz thought he was putting me in my place that day. Instead, he gave me a platform." Asked if she ever spoke to Cruz again, Crockett smiled. "He called once about a year later. Wanted to clear the air. I let him talk for 5 minutes. Then I said, 'Senator, I need to interrupt you.' There was silence. Then he said, 'I deserve that.'" Cruz went on to teach law, ironically, a course on civil discourse in politics. When Crockett walked into the Senate chamber for her first vote, she carried the same folder she'd had during that famous hearing, filled with transcripts and data she no longer needed, but refused to forget. Because preparation, she knew, isn't just about winning arguments. It's about changing the rules entirely. The 7 interruptions had become more than a viral moment. They marked a turning point in American political culture, a reminder that real power isn't about who speaks the loudest, but who refuses to be silenced. Jasmine Crockett didn't just defeat Ted Cruz. She rewrote the playbook for how voices are heard in power, and her lesson endures. Count the interruptions. Make them visible. And never, ever let anyone silence your voice.